There was a moment in American television history when one man's approval could change the entire course of your life. Not your week, not your season, your entire career. One nod from behind that desk, one laugh he let linger a half-second too long, and you were somebody. But the flip side of that power was something nobody talked about openly, something the audience watching at home never quite saw. Because when Johnny Carson decided you were finished, the silence that followed was louder than anything he ever said into a microphone. No press release. No confrontation. No final episode where you got to say goodbye. Just an empty invitation that never came, and a Hollywood machine that somehow already knew to stop calling. The story of The Tonight Show has been told 1,000 times as a celebration, as a legacy piece, as a tribute to one of the greatest entertainers who ever lived. But there's a version of that story that almost never gets told, the one about what it cost to exist in Johnny Carson's orbit, and what happened to the people who found themselves on the wrong side of his smile. That version is darker, more complicated, and if you're being honest, far more fascinating. Because the same genius that made Carson untouchable also made him, at times, ruthless. And the people who learned that lesson didn't learn it gently. To understand how Carson's silence could function as a career death sentence, you have to understand just how completely The Tonight Show dominated American culture during its peak decades. This wasn't a niche program for insomniacs or a background hum while you scrolled through your phone. There were no phones to scroll through. There was no streaming service to retreat into, no algorithm serving you a personalized highlight reel the next morning. When Johnny Carson came on at 11:30, you either watched it live or you missed it, and missing it felt like missing something that the rest of the country was in on. The numbers back this up in a way that's almost impossible to comprehend today. At the height of his run, Carson was pulling in 15, sometimes 20 million viewers a night. For a comedian doing monologue jokes about the news and chatting with celebrity guests on a studio couch, that was a staggering, culture-defining reach. Johnny had this almost supernatural ability to make television feel intimate. He wasn't shouting at you through a screen. He was leaning in, letting you feel like you were in on the joke. His timing was a kind of architecture. He knew exactly when to let silence do the work, when to raise an eyebrow instead of delivering a punchline, when to let a guest hang themselves with their own words and then rescue them with a grin. And the Carson wave, that simple gesture after a comedian's set, beckoning them over to the guest chair, was perhaps the single most powerful non-verbal signal in the entertainment industry for 30 years. Jerry Seinfeld, David Letterman, Ellen DeGeneres, they have all spoken about that moment the way soldiers talk about a defining battle. It didn't just boost your profile, it certified you. And what Carson certified, the rest of the industry took as gospel. But here is where the story shifts, because power on that scale doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't stay clean. The same authority that let Carson make careers gave him the ability to quietly dismantle them, and the threshold between his favor and his cold fury was never written down anywhere. You couldn't study for it. You couldn't rehearse your way around it. The rules were unspoken, which made them all the more dangerous, because the only way you learned where the line was by accidentally crossing it. Take the case of Joan Rivers, and to truly feel the weight of what happened between them, you have to start at the beginning. Not at the fallout, but at the moment Carson first believed in her. In the early 1960s, Joan Rivers was a woman grinding through comedy clubs in an era when female comedians were treated less like artists and more like novelties. She had been told, at 31 years old, that she was already washed up. Think about that for a moment. 31, and the industry had already written her off. Carson saw something different. He brought her onto The Tonight Show when the conventional wisdom said nobody wanted to watch a sharp-tongued woman dismantle her own life for laughs. And when she destroyed that first set, sharp, fearless, completely herself, Carson turned to the camera and told America, with that signature easy confidence, that they were going to be hearing a lot about this girl. He wasn't wrong. That endorsement rewired the trajectory of her career in a single evening. He hired her as a writer, gave her regular spots, and eventually made her his permanent guest host on the nights he took off. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale, the king of late night and the woman he'd championed from nothing, building something together. What nobody saw was what was quietly understood between them. That Joan Rivers, in Carson's mind, was his. Not romantically, but in the way that powerful mentors sometimes confuse investment with ownership. In 1986, Fox approached Rivers with an offer that would have made her the first woman to host a major late-night talk show on a major network. It was the kind of opportunity that only comes once, and Joan knew it. She also knew that NBC had privately made clear to her that when Carson eventually stepped down, she was not in the conversation to succeed him. She wasn't being considered. So she took the Fox deal. And here is where one decision, the order of a phone call, rewrote everything. Joan didn't tell Johnny first. Carson found out through the industry grapevine, and something inside him turned to stone. He hung up the phone when she called. He never wrote back. He didn't return messages, didn't acknowledge the letters she sent year after year, hoping for some kind of reconciliation. From the moment he found out, she ceased to exist to him. And because she ceased to exist to Carson, she effectively ceased to exist to The Tonight Show. Her appearances were buried, her name went unmentioned, and any entertainer who showed up on her Fox program quickly understood they were putting their standing with Carson at risk. Former staffers recalled that Carson felt genuinely blindsided. That to him, this wasn't about Joan taking a new job, it was about betrayal, about someone he'd lifted from obscurity going around him rather than to him. One person who worked closely with the show described the dynamic with painful clarity. Carson had treated her like a daughter, and in his mind, daughters didn't make moves like that without asking. Joan, for her part, never fully recovered from the loss of that relationship. Not the professional one, the personal one. She said in interviews that he was the single most important figure in her career. That she wrote to him every year. That she would have done anything, said anything, given anything, just for one conversation where he'd let her explain. When Carson died in 2005, she cried, not for the industry, not for late-night television, but because the man who had first believed in her was gone, and now the chance for any reconciliation was gone with him. Joan's story is the most documented, but it isn't the only one, and the variety in how Carson's displeasure expressed itself tells you something important about how the system worked. Some people crossed him in grand, visible ways. Bobcat Goldthwait, whose entire stage persona was built on chaos and unpredictability, literally lit a chair on fire during a guest appearance, a live stunt that had not been cleared, had not been planned, and landed him not just a ban from the show but a criminal conviction for arson, a fine, and a mandate to record public service announcements about fire safety. That one moment of impulsive performance ended his late-night access for good. Then there were subtler cases, quieter erasures. Howie Mandel brought a giant stuffed tiger onstage without telling producers. It wasn't dangerous, wasn't rude, wasn't even particularly offensive, but it disrupted the show's carefully controlled rhythm, and Carson loathed unplanned surprises with a depth of feeling that went beyond professional preference. The invitation never came again. And then there was Lola Falana, talented, magnetic, someone who lit up every room she entered, who spoke openly during one appearance about racism in the entertainment industry, about what it actually felt like to be a black woman navigating Hollywood during that era. She was honest. She was brave. And Carson, for all his cultural power, wasn't ready to hold that conversation in that space. She was never invited back. Not because she'd been disrespectful, not because the audience hadn't responded to her, but because she'd introduced a kind of truth that didn't fit the carefully managed emotional temperature of his show. Wayne Newton's chapter in this story plays out differently, because it's one of the rare moments where Carson's Cold War became briefly, unmistakably public. For a while, Carson and Newton had the easy rapport of two showbiz veterans who respected each other's lane, Carson commanding the late-night institution from Burbank, Newton owning the Las Vegas stage with a voice and a stage presence that packed venues for decades. But in the early 1980s, Newton outbid Carson for partial ownership of the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. To Newton, it was a business decision. To Carson, it felt like something more, a challenge, maybe even a dismissal, and he responded the way he responded to most things that unsettled him, through the monologue. Night after night, Carson began working in digs at Newton. Jokes about his appearance, his masculinity, his lifestyle, the kind of material that wore the costume of comedy but landed like something meaner. Newton endured it for a while, and then he didn't. He walked into NBC studios without cameras, without a publicist, without anything except the intention to speak directly to the man who'd been mocking him in front of millions. Whatever was said in that conversation, the result was clear. Carson stopped with the jokes. But the friendship, and the bookings, evaporated completely. Newton never sat in that guest chair again. It was the one time Carson got pushed back at openly, and even then, the resolution wasn't peace, it was just a different kind of silence. What's left, after all of it, is a legacy that refuses to be simple. Johnny Carson grew up a skinny kid from Norfolk, Nebraska, doing card tricks in the living room and calling himself the Great Carsoni, a 12-year-old already understanding, on some instinctive level, that performance was a form of control. He served in the Navy, studied radio and speech, climbed through small market gigs and regional television, and then in 1962 took the helm of The Tonight Show and simply never gave it back for 30 years. He became the highest-paid personality on television by the mid-70s, won a Peabody Award in 1987, and shaped the architecture of late-night television so completely that every host who came after him, Letterman, Leno, Fallon, Kimmel, Colbert, has been working from his original blueprint, whether they fully acknowledge it or not. He was married 4 times, and joked about his divorces with the kind of wry self-awareness that made audiences love him even more, though the sadness underneath was visible if you looked. He lost a son, Rick, in a car accident in 1991, and the grief that crossed his face when he returned to television was something audiences weren't used to seeing from a man who made effortlessly look like breathing. When he retired in 1992, he did something almost no entertainer at his level had ever done. He actually left. He moved to Malibu, spent time on his yacht, gave almost no interviews, and declined almost every invitation to return. He didn't chase relevance. He didn't miss the camera enough to compromise the exit. He died in January of 2005 of emphysema, a disease that takes you quietly and without drama, which, in its strange way, suited a man who had always understood that the best endings don't overstay their welcome. He left behind no memoir. No definitive tell-all. Just the laughter, still echoing in reruns, and the complicated, contradictory, deeply human truth that the man who made America feel warm every night was, in many ways, the coldest person in the room. That paradox is the thing that makes him impossible to reduce to a simple legacy, not a villain, not a saint, but something more interesting than either. A genius who was also, undeniably, a man.